Welcome, everybody. This is our Harnessing AI class section. This is our almost concluding lecture, the final lecture by Professor Rowe, who's been here before. He's talked to you about a number of things with AI, and today he's going to talk about a rather fascinating aspect of AI, is the risks of AI. As we've been going along, you've been hearing about various types of risks that exist, and he's compiled them all together. And also he's got some risks you probably haven't thought about before. And all of these things the more you're aware of the risks, the better you're going to be when you engage with AI systems and AI problems. So I think this is a very interesting topic, and please welcome Professor Rowe to talk to you about it.
Okay, great. So I talked a number of weeks ago, you've probably all forgotten about that, about the problems that some people worry about with AI that aren't really realistic. So for instance, AI machines taking over the world and making humans their slaves and things like that. So that's not a real risk, I don't think, because we want AI systems to be our servants, and that's the design criteria. But there are plenty of real risks about AI, and so some of these are the same sort of risks you get with any type of software, right? I mean, software always has risks associated with it, particularly if it's successful, right? And lots of people start using it, then you can broaden the risk, you can multiply the risk when you do that. So AI has some of those same characteristics because it's software, basically, like a lot of other types of software. So, but then there are particular dangers of AI in particular that I want to talk about. So for instance, everybody thinks of driverless cars, right? So if a driverless car wasn't programmed correctly, it could hurt people, definitely, right? Not just the passengers inside the car, but people on that it hits and stuff like that. So there's definitely some concerns that are pretty obvious about AI. And one of the problems is, of course, AI is different from, say, factory automation of robots, where if you want to know if a robot's doing the right thing in a factory, usually you can just look and see what it's doing, and that gives you an idea. But since a lot of AI is going on mentally and AI systems are thinking, oftentimes you can't tell if they're thinking the right things about some task, and so it gets harder to know if the AI is behaving properly. So that's one of the concerns with driverless cars. They might be thinking about stuff and you might not know what they're about to do and going on with stuff. So one of the problems, I think, the key problems with this is oversimplification. You can build something that can drive a car, but it's easy to make it oversimplified and not think of all the challenges that could occur in the real world. So an example I like to use is, suppose you're driving a car and you see some ball roll in front of you across a road. An AI system may not realize there was any danger there if the ball goes right across the road, right, and doesn't obstruct the car. An AI system might think that would be perfectly okay and keep speeding at the same speed, but of course that might suggest kids are around, and kids might be running across the road to retrieve the ball and things like that. So one of the problems with AI is that in anything that's safety critical, like a vehicle, you really have to anticipate a lot of little rare cases that could occur and be able to anticipate this sort of thing. Same thing happens with pilot training, for instance. They train pilots to think of a lot of different kinds of cases. So if you're going to have an automated drone, the drone is also going to have to be trained with all the possible things that could go wrong and where it could maybe injure another aircraft or something like that. So anyway, one of the reasons that there is oversimplification is there are financial pressures. At some point a vendor is going to say, well, I think I've covered all the cases, I'm not going to do any further work. But in particular, that can be a problem. And one of the questions is with neural nets is how many inputs should the neural net have? I mean, maybe there's some things that are relevant just once in a while, and maybe the neural net should have those as inputs, but in attempts to save money, that may not be an input to the neural net. So anyway, the issue would be that the oversimplified AI may not do things an ethical person would do. And so it relates to some of the stuff that Professor Strasser works on with ethics. Here's a famous example, so I got to show you the famous example, even if you've seen it before, the stop sign. So this was a convolutional neural network system, and so it was being trained to recognize stop signs, something really important for a driverless car, obviously. And so what the people did was they gave it a manipulated training set. They gave some examples in the training set and discovered there were things that it would misidentify that didn't look obviously different from normal stop signs, but would cause it to be just across the borderline between a stop sign and I think it was a 45-mile-per-hour sign. So that's a bad mistake to confuse those two types of signs. And then they figured this out by doing a lot of experiments with the training set, and then they tried to figure it out, well, they could just put stickers on a sign, little stickers attached to the surface of the sign to cause it to misidentify things. And they were able to show there were some really bad instances where it still looks like a stop sign to us, but what didn't look like a stop sign at all to the AI convolutional neural network. And of course the reason is it's not figuring out, this particular convolutional neural network was focused in little picky details of the picture. It wasn't looking at the overall picture. Obviously a stop sign is red and octagonal, and those should be the features that you should use to identify it. But if you're just looking at little groups of pixels, you may learn from machine learning that there's just small groups of things that always occur in stop sign pictures that aren't, and those might not generalize too well. So that was the key thing, that the input, the fault here was really that the input to the convolutional neural network was not sufficiently broad. Should have also had things like shapes and colors. Anyway, so another problem with AI, risk with AI, is there may be bias. So people have talked about this in the news lately. And so there's been, for instance, a famous example where there was a skin disease diagnosis system for doctors. So they'd take pictures of people's skin. Obviously this could be really useful, right? Because there are lots of doctors in remote areas and lots of areas that are underserved by doctors. And it'd be good to have something that where an expert in a long distance away could look at the skin problem and say what it was. But one of the things they discovered was it wasn't so great on black patients or brown skinned patients of any sort. So, well, obviously that's something that would be good, but often the teaching hospitals get a lot of people that are white-skinned and they would use their data to try to construct this system. So it was inherently biased, and it wouldn't do as good a diagnosis job on people that were brown or black-skinned. Another example is that what they found with radiology experts. One of the hot things right now is to try to develop medical systems for radiology, because it's a pretty visual intensive type of activity, and people are just looking at images and x-rays and other types of images like MRI and trying to make decisions based on that. So that would seem to be something good for an AI system to try to tackle. But one of the problems with that is you have to have a training set, and of course you have to go to subject matter experts who know about radiology, and they tended to have their own biases as to what they thought. And so if you develop a training set that has its own bias, then you're going to have a biased system there. So people are discovering that. That's one of the reasons it's often safer when you've got an AI system where you've got quite a diversity of training examples from a diversity of experts. Now, more than just oversimplifying, you can actually have bugs in an AI system, just as with any software. There's a number of famous examples of software that's actually harmed people. For instance, there was a X-ray machine a number of years ago that had a bug in its program, and it gave people 100 times the dose of X-ray that they were supposed to get because it had a loop counter in it, and the loop counter was faulty. So that's a classic problem in software, by the way, from the early years, and so this was actually hurting people. So there's lots of examples like with the car where people can actually be hurt. Of course, that includes financial hurt too. So if you've got something that's advising people on investments and it has a bug, that could be harming people too. So one of the questions is who has legal responsibility? So of course lawyers will argue about this endlessly. Generally speaking, when you sell a product, you're responsible for harm due to that product. The software industry has tried to get out of that to some extent. So they try to get you to sign things saying they have no legal responsibility for dangers. But there is a limit. For instance, if somebody actually gets hurt or killed by something, you know, then there's going to be a lot of noise about trying to have some liability with that. One of the reasons that there are bugs is failure of AI to explain itself. So you must have heard about explainability in some of these lectures as being a key thing that, and some of the methods we've talked about in this course have been more explainable than others, and so that's a key thing you can do. But even beyond that, malicious actors could insert bugs in AI. There's no reason that the bugs only come from the software vendor originally. And that's part of the idea of malware. Some malware actually functions like that, inserting bugs into code. So that could be a tool of cyber warfare. Then blame. One of the issues, as I said before, it's often hard to discover what to blame. Suppose a driverless car hurts somebody. What can we blame? I mean, there may be several different vendors who are responsible for the driverless car, or it could just be something mechanical wrong with the car too. So it may be actually the manufacturer of the car. So somebody has to make decisions about that, and that's been a key problem with a lot of the AI methods. For instance, with a neural net, often it's very hard to ascribe blame or credit for what the neural net is doing. So one of the problems with this difficulty of being able to ascribe blame with AI systems is that one consequence is it may be harder to fix the problems. If you don't know what's responsible, it may be hard to do that. That's the same problem that's been around in software for a long time. If you've got, if it's hard to track down a bug, if you don't have adequate tools to track down a bug, the bug may persist for quite a while. But anyway, we are getting better on explanation facilities. They will help with some of this blame assignment type problem. Now, one other interesting thing is that people may not be happy with the results of AI systems because they don't conform to their prejudices. So, for instance, supernatural phenomena. There's a picture of a ghost at the bottom there, a supposed ghost. People see patterns where patterns don't actually exist. And there are lots and lots of examples of that, like in gambling, for instance, and in conspiracy theories, lots of stuff like that. People like to see patterns. And so when you try to get AI to see these things, it doesn't see things. And so there may be a disagreement between people on that. So that's a risk of AI. It may tend to make people less trusting of AI. And one of the key issues we've talked about in this course is trust in AI. You've got to get people to trust it. Now, another issue with this, one of the reasons people don't always trust AI is it may not be thinking of all their needs. And since it's generally to create obedient servants, it should think about, it should be based on human needs. And maybe the AI shouldn't necessarily think about all its human needs when it's trying to decide how to do things. But the people that design the AI should certainly be thinking about all human needs. So one example I've seen in an emergency, maybe an AI system needs to assign different priorities than normal. So for instance, if there was a fire, all of a sudden, its priorities on normal routine activities should not necessarily be followed anymore. So say if a factory has a fire, the AI system shouldn't be worried about that. So there needs to be methods for other types of needs to, maybe even if they occur rarely, to change the functioning of an AI system. Similarly, another interesting issue is that if we have goal-directed AI, it may be based on criteria we don't like. There's a famous example in ethics called the trolley example. And in the trolley example, you see a trolley that's heading towards a bunch of people, like a dozen people. It's going to kill them if it keeps going. And you're a switchman, you can control a switch. You can flip the switch and it'll go and kill one person who's off to the side, but it won't kill the original people. So people have actually debated that in ethics over and over again, what you should do with the switch. And the utilitarian approach that I generally follow would be that you should kill one person instead of a dozen people. But if you follow rule-based ethics approach, which is an alternative approach to ethics, you would say that actually flipping the switch is an act of volition. You're actually murdering somebody if you flip the switch, whereas you're not actively murdering anybody if you don't flip the switch. So people have argued about that. Of course, that's what a lot of religions are based on. Rules for doing things, thou shalt not kill and stuff like that are basically a rule-based approach to ethics. And so this has created a lot of interesting issues. A lot of AI has raised a lot of interesting issues that I've worked on with Professor Strasser and stuff like that. So anyway, you're going to need to, if you're going to handle human needs, you're going to need to balance things like that and have an ethical theory behind it to really do it right. It doesn't mean every AI system has to have an ethical theory, but ones that, the broader the responsibility of the AI system, the more you're going to have to worry about issues like that. I certainly feel it's possible to embed ethics in AI systems. So for instance, if there's a weighing of different factors and people do that weighing of factors a particular way, and you want an AI system to do those tasks, you should maybe put in that weighting inside the AI system, have it making decisions like that. Just don't give the AI system unnecessary responsibility. That's probably a theme you've heard before. You don't want to, and with any type of software, you don't want to give it unnecessary responsibility. Another interesting issue, I've written a book on deception, and one of the things that people have postulated, maybe AI needs to lie and cheat sometimes, because people do it all the time, right? So, for instance, you may want to flatter people, for instance, and tell them that they're doing great when they're not necessarily doing great, because people tend to do better when you flatter them than when you don't flatter them. So, but is it ethical for an AI system to deceive us? That's one real interesting issue that's come up in a number of these more ambitious types of systems. Anyway, so another way to look at AI and possible harms of AI is we have got a lot of experience with robots in settings which are somewhat controlled settings like factories. Here's a robot that's used for assembling vehicles, a set of robots that are doing vehicles. So we do have some knowledge about the effects of automation. I mean, this has started from back in the 50s, right? There's been a long trend to automate different things. First, it was factory automation, so we were automating physical labor. But now with AI, we're automating more sort of managerial type activities, decision making and types of things like that. So all automation has a downside. Usually some people lose their jobs, at least immediately they'll lose their jobs. And so that certainly happened in factories. You can see this with agriculture. You know, agriculture has been tremendously mechanized since the 30s and 40s. And so the number of people living in rural areas has really decreased. If you haven't noticed it, it has really gone down compared to the 1900 or so. So this may happen in similar settings where there's a lot of managerial jobs that we're going to be getting rid of people. So what happens to these people? Well, in many cases, new jobs are created. That's the hope, that in many cases, new jobs will be created. Oftentimes, there are not as many, so you don't need as many people to run the factory anymore as there used to be required, because you don't need all the people that were just pushing data around, and because we can connect up networks and do AI to reason about what the data is doing. So one thing is people have been worried about is that AI may encourage a society where everybody lives on government support, because there aren't very many jobs anymore. And so we'll see what happens. There will be new jobs. It's very hard to predict, you know, and people ask AI experts to predict things. I think you've heard in this course that you know, they haven't always been so great. There have been people optimistic, there have been people who have been pessimistic, and it's, you know, there's been quite a variety of predictions, and then oftentimes a lot of people were surprised by what actually happened. I was surprised, for instance, that when I first saw some of the primitive things in the early 1970s, that we didn't have text processing stuff very fast. It took quite a while before we got decent keyboards on devices, but once that's happened, everybody's very familiar with text processing, and you get all sorts of great stuff on your cell phone now. But it took longer than I expected to get that. Other than the things that I didn't think would occur for a while, happened really fast. Some things like cell phones actually went real fast. Yeah, another issue people talk about is another ethical issue, which is inequality in society. So one of the risks of using a lot of AI is that, you know, there'll be haves and have-nots. There are people that have AI and they do all sorts of great stuff, and people that don't have AI and can't do as many things. So there'll be a gap between the people that have and have not. And we saw this during the pandemic, right? People that had their homes set up to do distance activities were in great shape. People that didn't have that were really struggling. So one of the issues would be, is everybody going to get AI? I mean, there may be a government, maybe need to be a government mandate where people are given an ability to use AI for lots of different things, not just the big corporations. One of the problems with that, though, is that you see a lot of the big neural net successes recently have been with massive amounts of data that only companies like Google have access to. And so as a result, they're getting the benefits of AI, but smaller companies aren't getting the benefits, and individuals for their own tasks aren't getting so much the benefits. Nonetheless, AI is pretty broad set of techniques, and there are things that will help individuals and smaller businesses more than big businesses too, and we're discovering those as we go along there. Interesting issue is the European Union has a law that actually tries to prohibit discrimination based on AI in data mining type things. So they try to prevent discrimination in things like mortgages based on somebody running an AI model and deciding it was better to give mortgages to white people than black people, for instance. That would be against the law by the European Union law. Well, obviously this is really hard to enforce, right? So, but nonetheless, that the Europeans are thinking about these issues in advance, and eventually these issues will get to the United States too. Now, another big issue that I'm sure you've heard about is violation of privacy. So, one of the things, collecting all this data and being able to make all sorts of interesting inferences about all this data is that, large companies and governments can track people more easily and see what people are up to. And for instance, there's a famous example where Google determined that a teenage girl was pregnant by the sorts of queries she was typing in. And so she was asking about things that were all symptoms of pregnancy, and so, but her parents didn't know. So Google knew before her parents knew. And so people were a little worried about that Google was able to pull all this information together. One of the reasons they know that Google was able to do that is because Google was using that to decide what to recommend to her. So it started recommending pregnancy tests, I believe, and things like that. So, that's one of the issues with marketing. So even though marketing would seem to be just to sell you supplies, there could be other implications of what Google has decided to market to you that might be things that are private that you don't want people to know about. And of course, people can be more easily tracked since, with cell phones and digital technology, you need to supply your location so that the network can connect to you. This is giving away your location, and also lots of sites ask for your location and stuff like that. So there's lots of better ways to track you. Now, why is that bad? Because that maybe could be how burglars can figure out when to visit your house and stuff like that. And people that are public figures could be targets of assassination attempts and stuff like that. So people can definitely get harmed by violations of privacy. And it's not just to be nice to people that you want to worry about privacy, but there are serious implications too. Now, another way to see that privacy is important is you look at Russia and China. They both are big fans of AI. So in the early days of the internet, people were saying this would broaden democracy because people would have access to lots of different ideas with the internet. Well, it depends what country you're in. If you're in a country that prohibits lots of access to the internet, in fact, the internet is a great way to control people. And AI in particular can look for subtle clues about what people are doing. So if people are planning a rally on a particular topic, AI methods could figure out what's going on with that. Of course, we're using some of the same technology in the Middle East. We have used some of the same technology in the Middle East to try to track what people are up to and finding terrorist organizations and stuff like that. So it can be used for good too, but it's definitely not being used for good in China and Russia here. And so that's one of the main concerns that people have had now, that it seems to be this AI stuff is really supporting totalitarianism in these countries in particular. And North Korea, of course, another example, right? Though they don't have as much technology as China and Russia do. So bad things can happen. It depends on, this is why you need to have some government controls. A government should be able to make decisions about what it's going to do with data that people have, and it can also have laws as to what companies can do with the data too. One of the things that's happened is now we got these huge digital companies like Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Amazon. They have as much power as a small country, so they can do all sorts of things, and they can be fascistic if they want. They can act like a fascist country if they want in many cases. So they, for instance, there are things where they try to lock you into products. They've always done that in commercial stuff, but they can really do sophisticated things now to lock you into their products. They can also try to cover up their flaws and their bugs and things like that, much like fascist countries try to obscure the activities they're doing in the interest of having a strong government. So unfortunately, they can use AI too to support some of these anti-competitive type activities. And so we'll see what happens in the future with a lot of this stuff. One of the things is there are a lot of choices we've got now. It isn't despite all these bad things I've said, we have choices, and in the United States we do have a democracy and we can pass laws. There's lots of different attempts you see from time to time to control the digital world and things like that. You've seen a lot of stuff about hate speech on social networking sites and stuff like that. So there's certainly been attempts to try to control some of the worst abuses, and so we'll see some of the things that happen in the future. But it's really hard to predict the future with a lot of this stuff. Okay, that's about it for what I had to say. Any questions or discussion?